Hello, this is Stephen Andrews, outlaw bookseller, author of 100 must-read fantasy novels, various other things like that. And this is another in my series of videos about horror. And as you've seen so far, I'm very interested in the idea of horror as not being a genre. If you haven't watched my clip about the fact that horror is a bricolage, not a genre, that it isn't pure, do watch that because you won't understand what I'm going to say here otherwise. But I just wanted to talk briefly about folk horror today, and it's a term we hear bandied about a lot. I think it was first used in about 1970 when a reviewer in a magazine was writing about Piers Haggard's film Blood on Satan's Claw, aka Satan's Skin, and Haggard himself, I think he used it in an interview around about 2004. And it's a term which has been kind of applied retrospectively. Initially, when people talked about folk horror, they talked about The Wicker Man, they talked about Blood on Satan's Claw, and sometimes Witchfinder General. The thing is that increasingly people seem to be falling over themselves in an attempt to label an awful lot of things folk horror. Now, I don't essentially say that's a bad thing. Obviously, there's a commercial element where people, are labeling things retrospectively and using it as a way of selling them. And a classic example is Damnable Tales, this folk horror anthology which came out before Christmas. And I've been reading this recently. I mentioned it briefly on my channel a while ago. And it's interesting because it says inside, here are the old fears. And there's a definite sort of sense of construct here where lots of things are being sort of grafted on. And it makes you question what folk horror is. Interestingly, I would say the best story in here is a true folk one that cleaves to the beliefs of a certain people in a certain place. And they're superstitious beliefs, they're pre-enlightenment beliefs, they're unscientific beliefs. And that's The Withered Arm by Thomas Hardy, which is in Wessex Tales, which is a fantastic piece of storytelling. And of course, the great thing about an anthology like this, it lets you sample all kinds of writers. Most of the writers in this I'd read before, people I'm very familiar with, like Robert Aikman, Shirley Jackson, LTC Rolt, M.R. James, John Collier, E.F. Benson, Sarky, Algernon Blackwood. It goes on. And, it's mostly old stuff. There's not much, in fact, there's nothing here from about the last 40 years or so, which sort of gives it more authenticity. But what exactly do we mean by folk horror? Well, I started thinking about this, and it struck me that the one way to define folk horror is that it's horror based on beliefs which are superstitious, pre-enlightenment, and as I say, have their focus in a particular place or location. And it's usually a rural one, though of course those beliefs and those locational things can move into the present. Folk horror isn't always fantasy. It isn't always actual supernatural content. If you look at the triumvirate of three films, if you look at The Wicker Man, nothing supernatural happens in The Wicker Man. Crimes happen in it, but there's no actual supernatural. But there is supernatural belief and there is a sense of place. But of course, as Lord Summerall reveals, the mythology, the folk mythology, is put in place by his ancestor to help support the community. And he takes advantage scientifically of the Gulf Stream to grow fruits. So it's quite interesting. And he uses it as a means of keeping his power as a kind of king over the rest of the people. And of course, we know that if Howie's sacrifice doesn't work, then they will have to kill a king, and the king will be Summerall himself. So, there's no actual supernatural thing at work. Blood on Satan's Claw, there is a supernatural entity. Witchfinder General, it's only supernatural belief. Matthew Hopkins is the demon. There are no demons. There's no God. There are no devils. So it's about belief. So straight away we see the folk horror is interesting because it encompasses things which are definitely supernatural, like the Blood on Satan's Claw, and things which are not, sort of pure sort of crime or political horror, like The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General. So that's quite interesting. So if you just root around what you have in horror, I think, you can claim all sorts of things of folk horror. And a lot of it is symbolic. In that way, it's rather like heroic fantasy. It relies on certain symbols. And just going through a couple of box sets here at random, I picked out some Blu-rays of things which could arguably be called folk horror. And I want to talk about them in a genre context and say whether I think they are or not. Well, first of all, this is Quatermass. directed by Piers Haggard, also known as the Quatermass Conclusion, sometimes as Quatermass 4 by fans. It's the fourth in the series. TV series, this was made in the 70s, was written in the 60s, and this has a folk horror feel because even though it's set in the future and it's dystopian and it involves alien intelligences, and by alien we mean science fictional, we mean something from another planet, and if you haven't seen it, it's brilliant, but it involves people with superstitious pre-enlightenment beliefs, the planet people. And I saw this very much as being a precursor of the Crusties. You know, this, say, I watched this on TV in the late 70s, and you know, one of the reasons why the BBC didn't make it in the 60s when it was first offered to them was they felt it was becoming already rather old hat. By the late 70s, it must have felt very old hat, except what we didn't realise was there was a new wave of hippie type people with superstitious beliefs coming, the Crusties, and they're like the planet people in this. So is it folk horror? Well, yes, the people in it are drawn to something ancient. It's just that the ancient thing isn't supernatural. It appears to be supernatural, but it's science fictional. Does it mean it's not folk horror? I would say no. I would say it is folk horror, because folk horror, like horror generally, can be of any genre. True detective get mentions a lot because it references subtly and without over-explaining or explaining at all the realm of Carcosa, which is mentioned by many writers of horror, you know, Clark Ashton Smith, H.P. Lovecraft, all these people, and it refers to the Yellow King, R.W. Chambers, The King in Yellow, the collection of 4 stories which were hugely influential over people like Lovecraft. And they were kind of like an American fantasy Machen, if anything, like Arthur Machen from Wales. So this, of course, is a crime narrative. It's about serial killing. It has no supernatural element. It has characters motivated by supernatural beliefs. So is it folk horror? Then yes, I would say it is. It's very, very rural. It's seated in place. It's deep-seated. It is horrifying. It has horrifying effects on people, even the survivors and the people who are dealing with the aftermath of it. So it is a very interesting one, but it's crime. True Detective, of course, is an anthology series. So each season is a different story. It's like a magazine. And, you know, if you haven't seen it, do it. It's absolutely brilliant. But I would say, yes, it is folk horror, even though it's crime. And that's the nature of it, as I say in my other video. Horror, some of it is SF, some is fantasy because it's supernatural, and some of it is just crime fiction because it could or has happened. Just another one at random here. This is the Indicator limited edition of Night of the Demon, aka Curse of the Demon, based on the story Casting the Runes by M.R. James. Wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, do. And, you know, it's loosely based supposedly on Aleister Crowley. And, you know, is this folk horror? Well, you know, it's an interesting one. It takes place in the English countryside. It's very moody. It's rural. It's about a scientist who doesn't believe in the existence of magic, and then it comes up. So it's supernatural. It's supernatural horror. It's fantasy. So we've got 3 examples there: science fiction, fantasy, and crime. So even though they fit into distinct genres of their own, they could all be claimed for the corpus of folk horror. Is it going too far? Who can say? I think if it has those true authentic elements of place and of superstitious beliefs, and if it truly is horrifying, then I think it works. I initially wasn't sort of keen on that idea, but I'm growing more open to what folk horror is. And of course, we're seeing people making folk horror films now, as before they just made a film and it ended up being a pendant of folk horror. So that's an interesting thing. I think one of the things I found on the internet looking at folk horror sites is that people are very keen to bring all sorts of things into folk horror, and it's in danger of becoming very woolly and vague and what have you. But at the same time, that's what's interesting about it, because, you know, an awful lot in horror is based on irrational beliefs, naturally. At the moment, I'm reading a book called The Fetch by Robert Holdstock, which was published in 1991. And Robert Holdstock was somebody who was very keen on writing about the ancient, archaeology, time, the mystical, the matter of Britain through Arthurian things. And, you know, I bought this secondhand a while ago. I'd never read it at the time. I read other things by him, and I'm a good way into it. And is it folk horror? Well, I'm not finding it particularly frightening, but it does have a lot of elements of folk horror in it. So I'm going to come back to Holstock and talk about him in relation to folk horror and folk horror and sword and sorcery at another time. So that's what to look at. But to a degree, the more you look, the more you find. You've got to argue the case, though. Does it have those pre-Enlightenment superstitious things? Is it localized? Like, for example, there's a book here by Tim Leben, who at his best is a very, very fine writer, called The Nature of Balance. This is one of my favourite books by him. And this is a book in which, as it says on the back, one morning the world is not awake. People lie dead in their beds, killed by their own nightmares. They're lucky. For the few remaining survivors, the new world is confusing, a terrifying place. Things are different now. The balance of nature, hence the title, The Nature of Balance, has shifted. Mankind is no longer the dominant species, and he is an intruder, something to be removed, destroyed by an earth bent on vengeance. So this is a classic thing of animals and nature fighting back against mankind. Does it matter what genre status is? Possibly. It's a while since I've read it, so I can't remember what the rationale is, but is it folk horror? I'm not so sure. I would have to go back to the source and see how much of it is based on irrational belief. And I don't think it is, unless the payoff comes up with us. So I need to look at that again. Anyway, there's some thoughts on folk horror and what it is and what it isn't. So we'll come back to this and look at it again. This is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now.